So I want to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about 2 days that changed my life and indirectly the lives of many other people over these past number of years. I'm going to tell you a story that's something that happened 30 years ago. This is why I'm telling the story now, because this week, right now, is the 30th anniversary of the most remarkable day that I have ever lived. Now, the greatest day of my life was undoubtedly the day that I got married to my wife, but the most remarkable day, the day that caught me off guard, the day that surprised me, the day that catapulted me into the following 30 years, these last 3 decades that I've been living, happened in May of 1990. Now, to put this story in context, I'm going to give you some of the background, then I'm going to tell you what happened, and then just make a couple of observations that may encourage you. And so, in November of 1989, I got a phone call from a friend of my father's. Now, this man's name was Dean Simpson, and he used to take short-term mission trips to different places around the world. He was based in North Carolina, over in the United States, and he called me up and he said, "We're going to Poland this next May, and would like you to come along." Now, he had just been to Poland the previous summer, and he wanted to take a follow-up trip. He had contacts there in Poland, and so he called me up. I have no idea why he called me, but it was interesting that even though I had crossed being a missionary off the career list, I was open to going with him to Poland. Now, the reason I'd crossed being a missionary off the career list is that I grew up in a traditional church that used to have these things called family night suppers. It's like a bring and share, and after the dinner, they'd have these about once a quarter, 3, 4, 5 times a year, and after the dinner, these people would get up and do a presentation, and invariably they were missionaries. And so these missionaries, the ones who would use these presentations, did this slideshow. And so these pictures, and invariably, number one, they were over 70 years old. Number two, they were living in third world nations. And number three, they were medical doctors. So I said, number one, I don't want to be 70. Number two, I don't want to live in a third world country. Number three, I don't want to be a doctor. So if that's what a missionary is, I'm crossing that off the career list. But I was open to going with my dad's friend, Dean Simpson, to Poland because for 2 reasons. One, when I was a boy, I read a book called Escape from Warsaw about 2 children who climbed out the window and up, scampering across the roofs of the Warsaw ghetto during the days of the ghetto uprising. They escaped to safety. So this picture of Warsaw and this dangerous place and the children there, that picture got lodged in my mind. And then the other thing that happened was just the year before, I read a book called God's Smuggler by a man named Brother Andrew, who used to smuggle Bibles into the Soviet Union. Well, at that time, the Soviet Union was very much closed, and taking Bibles in there was illegal. The Christians there couldn't have Bibles. And so those 2 pictures had been sown as seeds. So when I got this call to go to Poland on this short-term mission trip, I thought, yeah, sure, let's do this thing. Now, the other thing that was happening at that time is that this was just a few weeks after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in the autumn of 1989. And so this Berlin Wall, this picture, this graphic, physical metaphor or picture of the Iron Curtain, this divide between East and West, this divide between bondage and freedom, it had just come down. And so in the wake of this, Christians in the West we're wrestling with this question of how are we going to respond? What are we going to do? And so I went to a conference at the end of December 1989 in San Antonio, Texas. And after the conference, a friend of mine who had been invited by the man who brought this group together, he invited me to sit in on this meeting. Now, this meeting was a collection of apostolic and prophetic leaders from across the United States. Now, most of these Christians in this conference was a charismatic conference, and this group came together to wrestle this question. The leader put this one big question on the table. How are we, as the church in the West, church in the United States, how are we going to respond to this opportunity there in the East, now that there's this degree of openness? What are we going to do with that? Now, I was only 23 years old, and I remember being brought into this meeting and sort of hiding over in the corner. I'm like, who's that in the middle of who's who? I mean, I'm looking around, and these were all, at the time, These were brand name leaders, people that some of you are old enough that you know these names. So I just listened. And one of the things that was said there, just utterly fascinating to me, is that this guy said, I got a picture, and that what's happening right now is this battle between the spirit of the East and the spirit of the West. The spirit of the East is a tyrannical, controlling spirit. The spirit of the West is materialism and capitalism and these things. And the spirit of the West is stronger. That eventually the spirit of the West is going to conquer the spirit of the East. But before that happens, there's this window of openness, and we need to go now. And so all of this was the background for me going on this trip to Poland in May of 1990, May of the next year. And so I had already told, when I was at that conference, I'd already told my dad's friend, yeah, I'll go along with you. And so in January that year, I started talking to this in our local church. I was there at Kings Park International Church with Pastor Ron Lewis. And I remember walking across the campus of the University of North Carolina with him, and it'd say something like, why I like working with students? Because when I say we're going to change the world, you guys believe me. So I used to paint this picture of doing big things and changing the world. And so I knew in January that I was going to be going to Poland. And so I started talking that up amongst just a few of my friends and people in the church. And there were a few people who said, yeah, we'd like to go along with you. And so there were myself plus 5 others from Kings Park that said, yeah, we'll go along on this trip. And their names were Eddie Hilliard and Jen Molis and Marcia Ellsworth and Austin Welder. And then the woman who in April of that year became my fiance, Jean Hollenbeck. And so myself and these other 5 from Kings Park were part of this other mission trip that was led by a ministry called Christian Believers United, CBU. And we tagged along. And I remember going to the orientation, and there was a bit of cultural stuff, learning some of these Polish words, dziękuję, do widzenia, dzień dobry, and but the guy who was coordinating this is really interesting. He said, here's your visa application, but we're also going to do one for the Soviet Union. There's a chance that maybe we'll be able to go into the Soviet Union after we've been in Poland. And I thought, wow, that would be cool. But the focus of the trip was Poland. And so me and these other 5 people from Kings Park, we began meeting weekly and praying together, and praying and fasting. We'd fast 1 day a week with just thinking about this trip. I mean, we're going to go to Poland. Let's extend our faith. Let's dare to believe God that something great is going to happen. And as we prayed and as we fasted leading up to that May trip, God just dropped this thing in our hearts that he was going to do something great. So then the time came, May 1990, and we went on this trip. Gene and I had only been engaged about 3 weeks when we were there on the trip, and we went over, and in Poland, it was great, being, this is my first time being in Eastern Europe, and, seeing Warsaw and some of the other Polish towns and villages, being in some Polish homes, and it was a remarkable experience. But from a ministry side, I had a couple of opportunities to share the gospel with people that didn't know God, but most of our time we were spent just being with youth groups in some different churches around Poland. And as we were talking amongst ourselves, me and the other 5 from Kings Park, we thought, this is good. This is a fun cross-cultural moment, but this thing that God had put in our hearts, he's got to do something great, it really hadn't come to pass by that point. But then the team leader said, guys, it's worked out. We've got time. We're going to go over into the Soviet Union. And so we left Poland, and this was on a Monday. When you cross from Poland to the Soviet Union at that time, the railroad tracks, there's a different gauge, and so it was a bit of a lengthy process there. And we had Bibles, we had literature, and one of the most scared moments I've ever been in my life was when these Soviet guards, I mean, they must have gone to intimidation class for like 10 years. I mean, just their demeanor walking in, it's like they just leaked intimidation. It's just scared looking at them, and they're going to find our Bibles and these things. And I don't remember what happened, but somehow I think we got through with Bibles. and literature. And so we left Poland midday, and by the time we got into the Soviet Union, it was night. Now, the bit of the Soviet Union that we went into, crossing the train from Poland into the Soviet Union, it's now the nation of Ukraine, one of the Soviet Socialist republics of Ukraine. The city that we went into was called, or is called, Lviv. At the time in Russian it was called Lvov. It's also known as Limburg at one time when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it's been a bit of a political football over the years kicked about, but Lviv is how it's known in Ukrainian. So we got there on a Monday evening and checked into the Dniester Hotel up on top of this hill, but it was all dark. And I remember seeing the Soviet agent, the interest agent who was supposed to go with us everywhere. And so we checked in that night and went to bed. And the team leader told us before we went to bed, said, okay, we're going to meet in the lobby at 9 o'clock in the morning. So get breakfast and then we'll meet right here. And so we did that, went to bed, and met in the hotel lobby. And I remember the team leader, we had this meeting, we sort of prayed, but this is his big announcement. So we're in the Soviet Union. We're Christians. We know the gospel of Jesus, and this is what he says. So we're here in the Soviet Union. We don't know anybody in the city. We have no contacts, and we have no plan. So let's just break up into different groups and go out into the city and see what happens. Now, anybody who knows me just a little bit knows that I kind of like a plan, a little bit of a strategy. And so I immediately got into a bad mood, thinking, you know, if we only had a plan, God could do something great. But since there's no plan, I guess God's not going to do anything great. So I was just in a foul mood as we walked out the hotel lobby thinking, here we are in the Soviet Union and we don't even have a plan. So I thought, well, let's just walk down the hill and see what happens. And so we left the hotel lobby of the Dniester Hotel, and right outside there's a park. And so we just entered the park, and then it goes down a hill, and for some ways it's a beautiful park and just a wooded forest there. And when you come out of the park down at the bottom, we came out and looked up, and there's this really big building there, 200 or 300-year-old Austro-Hungarian style building, and we didn't know it at the time, but this is the University of Ivan Franko. Now, Ivan Franko is one of the famous poets from Ukraine. There's a giant statue there in front of the university, and so but we didn't know that it was a university. It was just this big building. But as we came out of the park and sort of started walking towards the building there, we noticed that there were a lot of younger people who were walking towards the building. And so I said, guys, let's go check this out and see what this is. And so we went up, and just right there on the steps of the university, just looking around, said, hi, kind of trying to look, and just someone else said hello back, and we met a girl there. Her name was Irena Kotsko, a 19-year-old student at the university, and she happened to speak English. I thought, wow, this is interesting. And then before we knew it, 4 or 5 of her friends were all standing around us. So we're standing on the steps of the university having this big cultural exchange moment with these Ukrainian students. Now, again, we didn't know it at the time, but we found out that they were all students in the English department of this university. They were all studying English. And for some of them, this was their first time meeting any native speakers of English. I remember I was struck they had learned British English. And being from the United States, this was just sort of odd for me. They would use these funny vocabulary words like calling a sidewalk a pavement and an elevator a lift and these things. But it was great. And so in meeting like native speakers of English for the first time, they were a bit overwhelmed and said, wow, maybe you guys would like to see the city. And so they decided to do the righteous thing. They skipped class and showed us around this city of Lviv. And this is fantastic. So my mood had gotten immediately much better from what it was, that foul mood up there in the hotel lobby. And so we're just having a good time. These Ukrainian students showing us around this beautiful city of Lviv. One of the things that they did, they took us in this old church building. Now remember, this is the Soviet Union. where Christianity had been severely repressed. There were churches, there were some officially registered churches, and then there was the underground church, but much of the Christianity there had been severely repressed. And this one building, this ancient church building, had been taken over, and it was now the Museum of Atheism. And they said that all the school children had to go through this every year, the Museum of Atheism, and they were shown how religion is the product of humans, that it was used by those in power to oppress the people. But there are interesting things like that, and they're showing us around the city. And about halfway through the day, as it got into the afternoon, the Holy Spirit started knocking on the door of my heart. I was like, "Hello, McFly." And the Holy Spirit came and said, "Hello, Tom. This is a gospel opportunity." I was like, "Oh yeah, gospel. That's why we're here." And so I turned to that first student that we met, Irena Kopsko, and said, "Irene, I'm a teacher on a university campus in the United States." Now, I didn't tell her that I taught the Bible as a campus minister. I was just 23 years old, and I didn't have any graduate degrees or anything, so I was just a guy. But I told her I'm a teacher on a university, not in the university, on the university in the United States. And I said, maybe your professors would like the students to have an opportunity to hear a native speaker of English. She said, that's a great idea. So we went back to the university, and she went and found her professor, who said, "We got some native speakers of English here, and this guy talks on university campuses, and maybe you'd like to have him talk." He said, that's a great idea. So they brought 5 English classes together and gave me an open podium. I remember walking into the lecture hall and looking up, and there's somewhere 80 to 120 people in this room. And it's an open podium for me to say whatever I wanted to say. Now, of course, I start thinking I've got to find a way to communicate the gospel to people that I'm beginning to think have never heard it before. And that actually was right. The very next day, we were riding through the city on a tram with Irene and some of these other students, and I just made this offhanded comment. It's like, well, like Jesus taught in the parable of the pearl of great price. And Irene stopped me and said, "No, I've never heard this before. What is this?" And it began to dawn on me. They had never heard the gospel. They'd never heard any of this. And so back in the university, I'm standing there. They give me an open podium, and I'm thinking, number one, I've got to find a way to communicate the gospel. But the other thing I was thinking is that I'm in the Soviet Union, and I'm getting ready to talk about Jesus and Bible and God. And so in that moment, I had to overcome this fear. The fear that gripped me was that as soon as I mentioned Jesus or God or Bible, Christianity, repent, believe, that secret doors are going to open in the back of the hall, and the KGB agents are going to rush in. That was the secret police. The secret police are going to rush in. They're going to arrest me. They're going to ship me off to Siberia, and I'm not going to be able to get married that year to my fiancée who's there with me. But in that moment, I overcame that fear and began to speak. And the way that I started was that, we live in an age where people in this part of the world are asking the question what freedom is. In the United States, we have a document called the Declaration of Independence, and it says that we have been given life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are inalienable rights given to us by our Creator. And I said that many people want life, they want liberty, they want the pursuit of happiness, they want the fruits of our system of government, but not necessarily the roots. That to experience true life, true freedom, true happiness, all of this comes from the Creator. And if you want that, you need to know the Creator, and I'm going to tell you how you can know the Creator. And so using that as a platform, I communicated the simple gospel of Jesus. This is who Jesus is, what He did, and what it means. Now, in that talk, sharing the good news about Jesus. Jesus came to solve a problem. The problem that he came to solve was human sinfulness. And so I used this word sin. And as soon as I did, the professor, who was sitting right on the front row, listening to everything that I said, as soon as I used this word sin, he raised his hand and said, "You just used this word sin. What does that mean?" Now, I answered his question and said that sin's anything that violates the character of God. God is good, so sin is anything that's bad. God is righteous. God is good. God is loving. God is pure. And sin is anything that violates his character, anything that breaks his law, which is rooted in who he is. So I gave him some definition, and it must have satisfied him, because from that moment on, he began furiously scribbling down and taking notes of everything that I was saying. Now, I found out later that he was intrigued about this question of sin and evil because he was working on his PhD in English philology on the notions of goodness and evil in the English language. His name is Vadim Fedotov. And so I finished the talk and said, "Are there any questions?" For a while they asked questions. I remember one of the questions was like, "So we were taught that an English king wrote the Bible 300 years ago. Where did the Bible come from?" So, well, no, King James did not write the Bible. That's a translation of Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. It goes back many, many centuries. And so I answered these questions, and it was just an amazing moment that started that day. If you remember, that day started with, "We have no plan," and before the day was done, we had the chance to preach the gospel of Jesus to a room full of English-speaking students in Lviv, Ukraine. So once that was over, we made an appointment to get back together the next day. We handed out some tracts and different things to the people and just sort of had some more cultural exchange. And when we got back together the next day, something remarkable happened. Now, that day had been remarkable enough. One of the guys on our team, Austin Welder, he and I were rooming together, and when we got back to the room, we just looked at each other and said, "Wow, what just happened?" That was amazing. But the most amazing thing was the next morning, as we were waiting for these Ukrainians to show up, they were going to show us around again, and I guess show us everything that they hadn't shown us the day before, since that day got cut a little bit short. And the professor, he was going to be part of this. And I remember as we were waiting there, just right in front of the university, as he's walking, looking up and seeing him, he's got this giant smile on his face. And he comes up and he says, "You know, Tom, when we left yesterday, you gave me a tract, and you told me to go home and read that, and that tract was just a simple statement of the gospel. And on the back of that tract, there was this prayer. And last night, I prayed that prayer. This morning, I came down and I announced to my family that I'm forsaking atheism, and I'm going to follow Jesus with all of my heart." Now, that moment was when I thought, wow, there is something here. And that was just the beginning. We began making follow-up trips, or other great people that eventually got involved. The Watkins got involved, the Bullocks got involved, and we planted a church there in Lviv in 1992, and in Ternopil in 1994, and Novodnestrovsk, and many great things have come out of that. But in reflecting back on just those 2 days, and really that one moment of stepping into that university, everything that we've done since then, it all goes back to then. And I was just a guy. I mean, I was 23 years old. 93% of the people listening to me know a whole lot more than I did then. I mean, for those who remember what I was like then, I was just borderline idiot. But in looking back, there are 4 key lessons that I just want to mention, and hopefully this will encourage you. This is what I take away from this little story. Number 1, err on the side of going rather than staying. Some of you are part of great churches. You're in a great city, a great town, part of a great church, and it's great and you're comfortable. It may be that God's calling you to go. Well, let me tell you what, err on the side of going. If the Lord speaks to you to stay, then stay, but Jesus has already told us to go. Number two, err on the side of saying something rather than nothing. The easiest thing in the world would have been simply to turn that tour of Lviv into a nice, fun, cross-cultural moment. We had already done that in Poland. I had no interest. God had put something in our heart. He's going to do something great. That only happened because we were willing to say something. There are times in your life, places, situations, opportunities, relationships. Err on the side of saying something rather than nothing. Number three, err on the side of boldness rather than timidity. I remember I had to overcome that fear that as soon as I mentioned Jesus or the gospel, the Bible, that these secret police were going to rush in and arrest me and ship me off. We all have moments where we feel timid. The Lord invites us, take a bold step and do something great. And that brings me to the last point, which is simply trust the gospel. Paul said this in Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation. When I was standing up there, you had that Declaration of Independence thing, but I remember thinking, the only thing I have to give them is the gospel. So I gave them what I had. But that's the greatest thing that we can give anybody. We shouldn't be thinking, all I have is the gospel. We should be thinking, I have the gospel, so I'm going to give you the best thing I've got. That's what Paul did with the Romans. He is writing in Romans 1, he's writing to a Christian church saying, I can't wait till I'm with you because I'm going to give you the gospel. Telling Christians he's going to give them his best, which is the good news of who Jesus is, what he's done, and what it means for us. So as I finish this little reflection of what happened 30 years ago this week, one of the things that has been a theme for me is what I call Jonathan and his armor-bearer kind of faith. Jonathan and his armor-bearer faced a strong garrison of the Philistines. And Jonathan came up with this brilliant plan. He told his armor-bearer in 1 Samuel, he said, let us go up. And then he said, perhaps if we go up, God will work on our behalf. Perhaps. We don't know, but we're going to give it a shot. God has a perhaps moment for you. Lviv, Ukraine, May 1990 was a perhaps moment for me. We didn't know what was going to happen. We just simply said, perhaps if we go, perhaps if we walk into this university, perhaps if we ask for the opportunity, perhaps if we preach the gospel, somebody might get saved. God has a perhaps moment for you, a perhaps situation, an opportunity, a place, a circumstance where you can step outside your comfort zone and trust God and watch God do something great. That's my story, and I hope that this is inspiring for you. And as you think about your life and your story and the opportunities that God's going to open for you, maybe this will inspire you with that perhaps kind of faith to step outside your comfort zone and do something great for God. God bless.